Hello, my name's Colin McDowell, and we're gathered here this morning to talk about John Galliano. Many things have been said about John, but what is really exciting for us is the fact that he's now doing couture at Margiela. When he was with Dior, he was very much a couture man. That was the important thing that he did, in my opinion. My colleagues here might disagree. And I'm just hoping that he's going to do something as marvellous and as exciting as Margiela himself used to do. So I'm going to ask the panel if they will introduce themselves, and then we're off.
I'm Rosanna Falconer. I'm a freelance brand consultant.
I'm Lara Johnson-Wheeler. I'm features editor here at SHOWstudio.
I'm Ruth Chapman, co-founder with my husband of Matches Fashion, which we recently sold.
Hi, I'm Dilara from Findikoglu, and I am a fashion designer.
Right, so before we actually start talking about specific looks, let's talk about the idea of couture and Margiela, because in many respects, the two men aren't sort of on the same wavelength in a way. I understand that Margiela, quite rightly, allows John to do it the way he should do it and wants to do it. But as we all remember, Dior couture was really very extravagant and very grand, whereas, of course, Margiela has always been understated. And it'll be very interesting to see which path John has decided to take.
Well, I think there's a similarity simply in terms of the focus on deconstruction. And it's very clear that what John is doing is using that deconstruction and embellishing it and, you know, putting his romantic touch on it. But it is interesting that you questioned this idea of couture. I spoke to Georgina Evans, who's our fashion editor. She's in Paris and just saw the show that we're talking about this morning. And she said, you know, it was an incredible spectacle, was telling me lots of interesting tidbits. But she said it was very interesting that as she walked out of the show, someone turned to her and said, well, you know, it was wonderful, but that's just not couture.
Wasn't she questioned on this?
Well, I believe they were rushing out of the show, and so she didn't really have time to say, why is this not couture? But I think that what John is doing and what they're showing is something that is it's out of the norm from what's on the Paris schedule. So I did wonder.
I wonder if that begs the question, is couture really a modern concept and does it need reviewing?
Of course it is.
And is John, with this new code that he's introducing here, questioning the very idea of what couture is, and is couture actually just a new form of art that's reflected through fashion and the highest level, the most creative form?
I think one of the key topics for discussion this season is the concept of couture, the concept of what the couture customer desires today, particularly in emerging markets. And today's Wednesday, tomorrow, Thursday, is a day dedicated to ready-to-wear designers invited onto the couture schedule, this highly coveted week that is seen as the pinnacle of fashion design, I think both by high net worth consumers and by designers themselves. And I think it does need to be questioned. The market is changing. And
it's not only couture, I think the whole fashion industry is changing and it needs reviewing deeply. I think there's still the big houses ruling the fashion industry, and there's a lot of young designers that need to be heard a bit more, I think. And we are the future. Let's say, 'cause I'm a designer and I have my own brand. We are the future and we're going to shape it, but we still have these old people trying to shape what we think is right and what we feel is right. And it's the same with couture. Like, I tried to do kind of couture stuff with my own work too, but I think like ready-to-wear buyers don't really like that, but as you said, ready-to-wear designers are going on the couture schedule. Where am I going to sit? Am I going to be in between, or like, am I not allowed to do couture because I'm a young designer? Do I have to do ready-to-wear or like super wearable pieces so I can sell and fund my own company? You know, all these things.
There's sort of a rebellion in you in a way.
Yeah.
You're rebelling against the system. And you're trying to find a way to rebel and to find your place in there.
Yeah, I think not rebelling without a cause. I just want to kind of find myself in this fashion industry, like all the other young designers.
Yeah.
Can I pin us down a little and think about what modern couture actually is? One of the advantages of being incredibly aged is you've been there before, of course. And I worked in Italy for many years for couturiers, and I know how to cut and put a sleeve in and all the rest of it.
I did not know that.
Oh yes, yes. I worked with a great designer who wasn't backed in the way that Valentino was backed, but was, in my opinion, much, much better. And that was Pino Lancetti, one of the great names of Italian artistry, really, not just the fashion thing. And I think people are talking about couture, and I don't think they know what it actually is. Couture is clothes conceived for an individual. They're hand-cut, they're handmade, and they cost a huge amount of money, and they are worn usually once. Even in the olden days of the 50s, which was the high point, the clothes were really just show clothes, and I have a feeling that a lot of the very rich people like Babe Paley and Mona Bismarck and people like that, I'm sure they borrowed evening dresses for huge shoes, because what can you do for them? I mean, where do you put them? I mean, you need a huge wardrobe. I'll tell you a story about Mona Bismarck, and it's true. She had a house in New York, she had a house in London, she had a house on Capri, and of course she had one in Paris. Did I say Paris? New York, Paris, London, and Capri, as you would. And every garment that she had made by Balenciaga was copied 3 times.
Wow.
So she had them in each of her homes. So all she did was she got onto the private plane just carrying a little leather box that people, do you remember? No, you don't, but your mothers would. Those little leather vanity boxes.
Oh, yes.
And that's all she needed. But the point is, the really serious point about this is that couture is not like other fashion. It's a completely different art. And it drives me mad. We see a little boy or girl comes out of art school, usually St. Martin's, not quite dry behind the ears yet, and they're running the couture for one of the great labels of the world. And you think, they're not doing couture. They're doing their idea of posh clothes. And unless you have lived with people who wear posh clothes a lot, you don't quite know what their purpose is. People walk in a different way in them. They usually can't sit down.
Well, that doesn't happen anymore. There's not many people who buy couture or wear couture.
Yeah, couture is the great con.
Tiny number.
You know, you might as well just say posh frocks, which we're going to charge you more for.
Couture is actually therefore the name of a week where things happen. It's just another moment in time where we're presenting more fashions and people are going to look at them. I mean, I think the interesting thing, to come back to what's happening here today at Margiela, is that John is definitely changing the rules. You know, you can see from the things that are coming up on the screen that it's not your typical couture collection at all. No. There's a lot of sportswear influences, a lot of extremely modern fabrications used there. So he's questioning himself who the customer is. I mean, when you look at what he's doing on ready-to-wear, he really understands who the customer is. When you're looking here, he's doing something which is incredibly creative. And to your point earlier, I think that gives a moment in time for people who really want to do that super creative thing. It's inspiring because you know that that's still warranted, it's still looked at, it's still relevant. And I mean, I don't know if he'll sell any of this. I'm sure he probably will. There'll be pieces, but my suspicion is he'll sell it to people who collect, and they'll collect it as you would one of Nick's pieces, or you know, it's collecting creativity and supporting creativity, which is something we need to do. I mean, it's
He's pushing the barriers, which he always does.
Yes.
But I think one of the things I want to say, and then I'll stop banging on about old-fashioned couture. But Hardy Ames once said to him, "What is your job?" And he said, "To do honour to the cloth." Now that's an amazing thing to say. He was much more intelligent and much better educated than any other person probably I've ever met in fashion on the creative side. And that's what John is doing. He's not sending down a T-shirt with a silly, you know, what was it? What was it?
Oh, the slogan T-shirt. Are we thinking of the same Dior one, or perhaps we're on a different?
No, we're not thinking of the Dior one. We're thinking of the. Yes, we won't go any further. Won't go any further. But I mean, look at these marvelous iridescent fabrics that are coming.
That's
The interesting thing about
They're beautiful.
So I said I had some information.
Yes.
So the thing about these is that, so obviously we're not looking at any catwalk images because photographers were not allowed at the show. But when people got their invitation, there was a translucent piece of paper which said, flash photography is encouraged. And the reason the flash photography was encouraged was that when the garments went down the runway, so the atelier was all painted black and there were UV lights, so everything was sort of very strange and you didn't know what you were seeing. The garments would come down the runway and they looked a certain way, and then as people took flash photography, because of the sort of 3M effect on the garments, on the materials, the clothes would sort of transform before your eyes, so you would see it in a different way, it moved in a different way. Illuminated, exactly.
I think that's a really interesting use of, for the last 10 years really, I think designers have been trying to decide how to approach this brave new world of tech. We've seen really terrible uses of tech for tech's sake, where it's felt really gimmicky.
Like gratuitous.
I saw quite an interesting use through Google Zoo, which is the creative arm of Google, of using Google Maps to map out somebody's journey, and then it imprints on their dress in Swarovski crystals last season, which was fascinating. But I think this is just seamless. It's something that if this was genuinely bought by a couture client, as she probably would be on a night out with people using flash photography on their iPhones.
You can see here.
It's a very logical use of technology.
Absolutely.
Those pieces will definitely be interesting. I mean, we'll get a lot of consumer interest, I think.
Because they're beautiful. They're absolutely
Ruth,
beautiful.
who do you
Look at the way it's
imagine?
moving.
Who do you imagine would, do you have an idea of that customer who would buy that?
Yes, definitely. I mean,
yes.
you know, at Matches Fashion, 2% of our customers created 30% of the revenue. So there's women who are so compelled by fashion who really want to collect those pieces. I mean, you know, it's a passion. It's something that you
I
love.
always worry that when, you know, trying to design stuff, I'm like, oh my god, this is not going to sell. But then sometimes I forget that there's also people that collect items rather than just buying what they wear daily.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I'm loving about this also is the fact that it's not channeling what Dior did in the 50s. It's not channeling what Balenciaga or even Yves Saint Laurent did. It's completely new. I must say, seeing this yellow, and I am so sick of this acid, bilious yellow. I absolutely hate it. It's got no place. Designers, I hope you're listening. It's got no place.
You're done
Look
with
how
yellow.
that was showcasing the work of the person who made it was remarkable, and I think that's something. What's interesting to me about this is that it feels like John's really at home where he is, and he feels comfortable with the house codes now, which he's been so respectful of, and he's doing what he wants to do within that construct.
In the last few collections, it definitely feels like there's a movement from one to the other that's very clear. You can see that thread that runs through.
But you see, I think your word respectful is absolutely right. I think that Margiela agreed to John because he respected what he had done. And I think it's also the other way around. Obviously, John is not going to ride roughshod over what Margiela has spent many years of a very special career, in my opinion.
Yes, very special.
Doing, you know, which you cannot say is true of some of the people who are being pigeonholed or forced into doing work for hugely important names, and they don't have a clue.
I mean, I'm finding this really inspiring, watching the things, particularly the shoes that. Did you see the shoes that came down? The sportswear influence.
Yes.
So they're all wearing sneakers. No one's in heels.
So they're all in sneakers. There's a lot of parkas. There's a lot of
really modern fabrications, and yet there is this really elevated sense of someone who is, I mean, it's so great.
It's really
the workmanship, you can see it's really inspiring for you. It must be super inspiring to see the level of workmanship in there, and yet you get this, back to that old word, this couture sensibility when you see them coming down. And there's a myriad of ideas here, but they've been so elegantly crafted and put together that it's wonderful to see.
What I'm interested in, sorry, go on,
It's all right,
please. No, please.
It shows that the tech fabrics shouldn't be only in a minimal or sporty way, you know, because most of the young designers, or like anyone, uses these fabrics in a really plain way, and they can't really imagine them being this kind of glamorous dresses. I think it's really innovative what he's done and how he played with it.
And the weights that he's used are perfect because nothing is too heavy or clunky. It's just all really
It's amazing to see that fabric in a pleat, in such a tight pleat there. It's nothing I would have expected.
extraordinary.
And of course he can adapt that, make it more butch for his menswear.
Corsets
Men
and
would
stuff.
wear that shiny stuff, you know.
And the colour palette, I just find is so intriguing to the eye, and when you see the full narrative at the end of the show here, it's wonderful to see, and I think very different to the past collections.
Yeah, and also I think that something that we always used to talk about at Matches Fashion was the fact that if you can garner the attention and respect of the fashion industry, the filter to the customer is stronger. So I think as a branding exercise for the House of Margiela, I think this is a genius collection to come out. I think it's modern, it's relevant, all our eyes are on it, we're looking at it, and it makes us have a renewed respect for the house, for clothes. It's a great reminder of what the house means. So I think hats off to him.
Also, of course,
It's amazing.
It's pretty wearable.
Yeah.
A lot of it is really
what
wearable.
I'm interested in, because you know John has an incredibly complex and sophisticated visual brain, as it were. I'm wondering if we're moving into a period, because he's going to become a leader very quickly in couture again. I'm wondering if we're moving into a period where colour is going to come from the shine of surfaces. I'm so hoping that is the case. I'm sick to death of crude colours. Hideous yellow, the wrong blue, the eye-watering pinky red, you know. Everybody does it, and look at these, you see, you can do so many things with this. I'd like to see
you can.
no specific printed colour. I mean, look at that green, I mean, it's terrible.
I like that green. I love that green. I know what
We've
you mean.
seen it so many times.
Yes.
Anyhow, I'm not criticizing him because I think this is
Yes.
I think this is really right up where he used to be, and
Yes.
it makes me exciting to think, what is he going to do next?
Yeah.
It's really exciting.
And if you were to think, back in the 80s, if one had been discussing what will fashion be in 2018, and if you look back at kind of projected imagery of what that might be, there were a lot of shiny fabrics. It was what people were predicting. It's just, I think they were predicting holographic and silver, and actually the thing that's so fantastic here is the kind of fabric, like things like, I noticed he used something called prism film, which I'd never even heard of, and PVC. They're being used as a vehicle to portray colour and to showcase colour, rather than just a shiny surface that looks really modern and space agey.
There's something quite interesting. There are all these clear sort of perspex jackets and things, and if you look closely, they're disguising sort of chinoiserie fabrics underneath.
Yeah.
And
Yes,
being
which is
held
very
with those.
subtle.
It is very subtle, and
Very
so these
subtle,
sort of, you know, they're slightly more reminiscent of the Dior days, but they look kind of like disguises. They're they're transformed.
Yes.
There's a story underneath.
Yeah, and the parasols are maybe a nod to that
Yes.
as well.
Yeah.
And I think they very much changed the way you'd look at one of those pieces. It feels like something.
We're already, in a way, in the coming into the era of shine, I think, even on the high street now.
Definitely.
But I think the way he's done this and the way it picks up colour is going to give this a real boost for the high street. I might say a very useful thing to remember is if you spill anything on this, you just wipe it off.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, with
Really
a paper handkerchief, it doesn't leave a stain.
Fantastic.
So that's a selling point.
Yeah, true. Yesterday, I was talking to Olivia Firth about blockchain and how that might impact fashion in the future. And it does occur to me here that if they could find a blockchain and chip it into one of these garments or into a whole look for these garments, and it was then bought by a collector, you would have the story and the craftsman and every person that had touched that garment. It's kind of a great archiving tool and a great, because you could plug it into something and then you can have the whole story of John and who was there, right down to even the interns, and you know, the fabrics and the inspiration would just be on this chip.
Fantastic.
Would be, and that would be kind of incredible. So I feel like, to your earlier point, that's the best way of bringing tech to impact on fashion is, and you know, we were talking because Olivia is concerned, as am I, about you know, how much people are paid who are making garments.
Oh, sure.
Not in this world perhaps, but in other worlds. And you know, if that can affect the common T-shirt, so we can see how much people were paid who made that T-shirt, then
Spying.
the whole world opens up, and this becomes even more meaningful in terms of.
If we go back to John, Margiela and couture, although I think the point you've made is very interesting.
Yes.
How do you think this, we've seen a few couture shows now, how do you think this is showing up as, is it going to be one of the top ones? Are there others that you personally think are more directional, more beautiful, more interesting? Is he absolutely on course, do you think, with this? Or has he got a couple more steps to go, a couple more seasons perhaps?
Yeah, I
What do you
think
think?
maybe this is like the first step into this tech future fashion. Well, I mean, he used some elements of this before in the previous couture shows, but this is, I think, where he really showed it to people. But I'm like kind of curious to see what he's going to do next. But I think this is very innovative, and I don't know if people will call it, or this is the best couture show I've ever seen, but it's definitely the most innovative one that he's done at Margiela.
Yeah, I've been a bit remiss really because I haven't asked you a very important question. Is there anyone who doesn't like it particularly?
Well,
I've been assuming everyone liked it.
I began this morning by saying, because I think I'm on a table of Margiela fans and you all have pieces and have bought pieces, it's not traditionally my style, it's not something I would ever even, if I were in matches, it's not something I would ever even gravitate towards. I love colour and maximal detailing, and it's not me. However, for the first time today, I've kind of sat up and taken notice, and obviously I was a huge fan of John and in everything that he did at Dior. I think in a lot of ways you can't be of my generation working in fashion and not be adorned my walls as a teenager. Nick's very photos.
Yes.
But this is actually the first collection I've seen today where I feel like, oh, it all makes sense. And I can completely see, I think it made sense for his career to move to Margiela when he did, and I think the handover was seamless and done with such respect on both parts. But now it makes sense to me as somebody who loved that original Dior style. Yeah, I'm really excited by it.
I think I really love the collection. I think the thing that I like so much, I like when you can see a story. I really enjoy it. And I think Nick was telling me a very good story, which is about when John was inspired by this. Okay, so you can see these glitter caps, and lots of the past few collections are very much inspired by the shower and coming out of the shower. And so John came out of the shower one day and he had some shampoo in his hair, and he said, oh, go walk the dog. So he went for a dog walk and just threw a mac on and had wet hair with a bit of sort of suds left in it. And apparently he said that this was the most glamorous he'd ever felt.
Oh wow.
So the women's wear show, when he had all of the mats and they're sort of falling off the shoulder and there's sort of feathers everywhere. That was very much that, and that carried through into the menswear that we showed sort of 5 days ago. And I love that you can still really feel this here, and the show notes have talked about this relaxed glamour.
Yeah.
And I love that story, I love that idea.
There's as much glamour here as there is in a pair of stiletto heels and a big puffy.
Exactly.
And it feels
Much more so. Much
there
more
are no
so.
heels, there are these clunky trainers that are carried across from the menswear too.
Absolutely. And actually, I love the idea of a story, because when I go and buy things from Margiela, generally the things I buy are the quieter pieces that build a wardrobe. But I do like the idea that I'm buying from this house that has this creativity and this.
Would you buy a couture piece?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't yet. I'm really interested. I mean, there are pieces on here that, I mean, that black suit, you see it? I wouldn't buy the really, the probably more interesting pieces. The trench that came, the iridescent trench, I would certainly wear.
Would you buy one piece just to see how it looks?
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting.
Yeah, I think so.
I think they're probably beyond the price of rubies, aren't they, at this point, I would think.
I would think I would think a lot of these pieces were out of reach. But
The shiny ones, the ones where he's doing something different. There's obviously been a lot of experiment as to how well it can cut. I mean, presumably they can sit in it and all the rest of it.
I'm not averse to the idea of potentially buying a piece of this and having it in my home on a mannequin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's a different thing. That's like having one of Nick's pieces on your wall. It's-
I'd really love to buy one of the parasols. For example. And just wear it. It's a beautiful, it's an entry point piece, and I think that
Or the shoes.
it has but the parasol, it does have so much of that story, and it's a nod to
Totally.
so much of his history, and that's what.
Yeah.
And I think the idea of the story is something that is integral to couture. And going back to what you were saying earlier about being able to trace something from the very first person the very first sketch right through to the petit main, I think that is what has always been at the heart of couture and remains today, or should remain today at any design house on the couture schedule.
I love
that
this
attention.
blockchain idea. I think it should be an exhibition.
But
someone should take
absolutely,
this.
but it should be in
someone.
I think FIT and MIT. I think they're all working on
They're trying to
the
do
idea
that.
of it, because if it, I think as we become more conscious of what we're buying and how we're buying it and who's made it, and the parallels, the polarized world of wealth and how that sits, which couture always has that sort of, it's the elephant in the room in a way. And when you think about that, blockchain comes in to be really meaningful in terms of us knowing exactly like who made your t-shirt and
we started this conversation talking about what was couture, what is couture, and how people are trying to do couture and not necessarily knowing what it is. And I think that will prove Colin's point exactly. And you can exactly show, and couture then will be redefined exactly as it should be.
Absolutely, yes. It's meaningful.
Right.
And that's my suit.
I was going to say...
That's one
I was going to say something else, which I think is quite interesting. As you can tell, I'm becoming more and more obsessed with this cellophane sort of look. One of the great writers about fashion, I can't remember who it is, a costume historian, said the thing that is most missing now in ball gowns and everything is the allure of the rustle, not the bustle, the rustle, the sound of the swish that when they were all dancing. Now, wouldn't it be lovely if this came back and we could hear some sound?
I would love to hear that movement.
It's a very lovely quote. I do see what you mean.
I can't think who it was now. It's someone who was writing in the 20s, I think, or 30s. I can't remember. But it's true. We're all very boringly silent, really.
There's so much noise, isn't there? Isn't there too much noise? I mean, that's why we're.
Well, I suppose that's true.
We need to,
I mean, if it came in, imagine walking down Oxford Street with every, it would be unbearable. But this isn't unbearable. I think
There's
this is
noise
so lovely.
here that when you're out on the street, if you wanted to, I mean, that coat, the completely transparent one with the big polka dots in, I think, PVC, I think that would give you some noise. That could be quite sexy, actually.
Yes, it could.
Yeah.
It could.
Yeah.
And see, that's another thing. If the little boys and girls who make so many of the clothes, who design so many of the clothes, actually want all bright sort of nursery colours, the idea of putting them behind a cordon sanitaire, as it were, of a fabric that is going to soften it, is very encouraging to those of us who don't like hideously bright, strong colours sort of bouncing off our old eyes. So, you know, there's a lot in this. There really is. Does anyone have anything else?
I think there's
They
one
wish
thing
to
that
add.
the artists,
We're going to speak
exactly, we were, yeah.
So
Okay.
for the first time this season, Galliano has, well, in his time at Margiela, collaborated with artist Jessie Reeves, who's a 31-year-old. And he said when he first saw her art that his heart kind of skipped a beat, and he was enraptured by it straight away. And they both have the same approach to creativity, this idea of deconstructing something and showing it. It's actually the seating and the set. It's all these kind of slightly imperfect but beautiful pieces of upholstery. You probably know lots too.
Well, she took the idea of this sort of traditional seating in a couture show and built this sort of these blocks, these very kind of aggressively like warped blocks around this. I think they're leathers or something. You can see them here.
Yeah.
And so it was supposed to again reflect this idea of relaxed glamour that was present in the show. I think they're quite extraordinary. I wonder.
Yeah, they
I think
are.
some people sat on chairs and some people in fact sat on the piece itself.
That is.
Doesn't seem right to sit on a piece of art. Does it, really?
But then if couture is a piece of art, then they are being sat on too. That is a very good point. Yeah, I think I just love the idea of, I think one thing I've really noticed about John always is that he's so articulate, and unlike a lot of designers, when he speaks to the press, I bet you found this as a writer, it must be a pleasure to talk to him.
Oh, yes.
Because he is so fantastic at conveying his creativity. And I loved hearing him talk about Jessie the artist because he was so fired up by it. And I think it's inspiring to hear a designer fired up by a fellow creative and using it in their couture show.
Yeah. As we're sort of doing a roundup now, would we like to continue it? We've got your views. Anything more you want to say?
I think maybe just a small point about the styling. I think that the garments themselves are so wonderful. I just am so interested in the way that he's brought back, I've mentioned the shower the other day, but Eugene Solomon did these kind of glitter headpieces. I love it that it's an elevated nod to that as well, and it's still part of the story. And then you've got those big Pat McGrath lips.
Yeah.
I think it's really very beautiful. That's my piece.
I agree. I think it's the most beautiful couture thing I've seen in ages.
I agree.
And I think it's almost revolutionary in a way. I think it's exceptional.
I
We
think
need
so.
revolution.
Yeah, I think it's great, and it's so inspirational. Rather than seeing like layers of chiffon on top of each other. Okay, you know what I mean? Okay, give me something new, and this is going to inspire everyone. Because unless a big designer like John Galliano does something like this, none of us can do it, because then people will be like, why are you doing that? But you know, this is great because I think he always opens loads of creative ways for other creatives, which is, you know, amazing. Like he inspired every designer, including Alexander McQueen, you know. So
Yeah.
he still keeps inspiring everyone.
I read in the show notes before I saw the show that there was going to be tulle. So I had this idea of, okay, there's going to be lots of, and there is tulle, but it's very, very subtle. And I really I think that,
It's almost an accessory to what he's actually saying.
and I always think, okay, tulle, so things will be very feminine. I think these do feel very feminine, but it's sort of, it's totally a subverted idea of what that means.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been very, very interesting, and you've all been marvellous. And I don't think I've interrupted too much, I don't know. What I would say, wouldn't it be lovely if next season everybody has realised that couture can, in fact, be modern and not a pastiche of what was happening in the 50s and 40s and 50s. And really, the one thing about John, I mean, he's quite frenetic when he's working. He's frenetic because he is totally involved. I think we have so many young designers now who are only involved with parties and money.
Yeah.
You know, and they're looking at old copies of Vogue and all the rest of it. Not the way to move a very important industry forward. Thank you very much indeed. It's been very interesting.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.